Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. I'm Lenny Esposito, and today we bring you a special treat. I, as a fellow of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics, recently had the opportunity with my colleague Anthony Costello to sit down with Dr. Stephen C Meyer of the Discovery Institute and discuss the advancement of intelligent design in 2023. Now, Dr. Meyer was recently interviewed on the Joe Rogan podcast, and his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, has really gotten a lot of attention lately. In fact, intelligent design seems to be growing in our public discussion, and we're finding out more and more about the complexity of life and how the order of things in our biological systems really does point to a creator. So this will be the first of two parts to the podcast. Next week we will bring you part two. But here we talk with Dr. Meyer about how the intelligent design movement has advanced, what the God hypothesis is all about, how we're seeing new evidences for design in our biology, and just all that's happened since the ID movement was declared deceased in 2005. I hope you enjoy the discussion here on Come Let Us Reason Together.
Okay, everyone. My name's Anthony Costello, and welcome to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. We have I've gotten into the habit of saying we have a very special podcast every time we record one of these, but I have to say that this one is pretty special. And I'm joined today by Lenny Esposito, fellow at the Kirkwood Center, and someone who Stephen, do you think we could say of you someone who needs no introduction, or is it?
I don't think we've reached that point yet.
Okay, not yet.
You don't need to introduce me but anyway, yeah.
Well, we're joined by Dr. Stephen C Meyer, author of many good books, a fellow at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, an organization that I've been supportive of for many years and greatly appreciated. And we're going to talk about several things with Dr. Meyer today. Certainly his new book, which is right here, Return of the God Hypothesis, which, Steve, I gotta say, I almost feel this one could be like entitled Summa Apologetica Scientifica. I mean, it's quite the summary of all of the scientific evidences that we have for a theistic design to the universe. But Stephen, before we get into the book itself and some of the metaphysical and theological implications that this theistic design argument would entail, I got to ask you some questions about just what's going on right now for you and for Discovery and for the ID movement. I mean, we've watched you over the years go on to university campuses and debate, sort of so crusty old intellectual types, and seen some of your battles there. Now all of a sudden, we see on the Joe Rogan podcast, Brian Callen, and this has got to be quite a shift in the sense of really opening up some new avenues for you, for your work, for the work of the Discovery Institute and intelligent design in general. Maybe you could just sort of give us, an update and what you think is going on there, just sociologically a little bit.
Well, I think sociologically, there's a much greater interest in the God question. I did a interview last fall with Peter Robinson of Uncommon Knowledge. His show comes out of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He was at a conference I attended in Italy, and he did a three-way interview with Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, and me about the God question. And Douglas and Tom had been describing themselves as Christian atheists, meaning that they both lamented the loss of a Christian foundation for culture, but couldn't quite get themselves over the line to actually believe in God. And I think there's a whole class of what I've been calling the new atheists who aren't angry at religion. They sort of miss it and wonder, or, lament that the West is failing because it's losing its Judeo-Christian foundations, but themselves are not believers. Now, after the interview with Peter Robinson, Tom Holland told me, "Well, I'm no longer an atheist," he said. So he's moved in a very decidedly theistic and even Christian direction in his thought. But I think that's just indicative of what's going on. Justin Brierley, who has a wonderful program in the UK, did until recently, called Unbelievable, and he's interviewed so many different people about the various facets of Christian theology or theistic belief, and it has done these kind of debates, on air. But he's got a new book out about the surprising rediscovery of God, that people are after the early 2000s with the intense focus or interest in the case of the new atheists. I think there's a sense that those folks have overplayed their hand, and that actually there's a lot of good evidence pointing in the opposite direction. I mean, the main argument of the new atheists was that science properly understood undermines belief in God. And yet, if you read their books carefully, they're not really addressing the sorts of evidences that I've been putting forward in Return of the God hypothesis, the cosmological evidence. They have a very thin treatment of fine-tuning. And even Dawkins has this wonderful quote where he says that the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And yet 2 summers ago, a new animation came out from an Australian group of the DNA replication system. And Dawkins himself professed to be knocked sideways with wonder or disbelief.
Yeah,
right. At the digital information processing system at work inside the cell. These are the things we're discovering inside cells, from just the brute fact of the digital code in DNA to the even more elaborate characterizations that scientists have now been able to make of the exquisite, functionally integrated information storage, transmission, and processing system. It's at work on a miniaturized scale in cells. It is mind-blowing. It's not at all what you'd expect from purely materialistic processes that were blind, pitiless, and indifferent. It looks for all the world like a design system. And so I think there's both an evidential and a sociological turn that's I think reopening the question of certainly intelligent design. I think we're attracting more and more high-powered scientists to the intelligent design research effort and research program. But I think just more broadly in the culture, I think there's a sense that perhaps the wheels are falling off in various different ways. We have these mass shootings, we've got teen suicide and anxiety rates through the roof, and maybe it's time to reconsider this sort of facile setting aside of belief in God that was part of the new atheist push from say 2006 to 2015-16, where I think at some point in the last few years there's been a waning of influence and a sense that in some cases, even in some of the more prominent spokesmen are even becoming sort of figures of ridicule, especially in the UK, where they've really overplayed their hands. So I mean, that's just one facet of it. There's so many things going on in the culture, but as far as the media interest, that I think that's just an indicator of what's going on.
Well, and of course the new technology and just what opens up with regards to sort of podcasting and YouTube and the new media being kind of the source of our public conversations now as well, right?
Well, right. I when I did the last book, Darwin's Doubt, there may have been some podcasts in there, but it was just getting started
early
2013, and I did a couple hundred talk radio interviews or C-SPAN book TV and that sort of thing, and all that stuff still exists, but the podcasting revolution has been extraordinary. And of course It's a week now since the Joe Rogan interview went live, and I can tell you my phone has just been blowing up. People heard from in a long time, have seen it, and I don't have to tell anyone that hey, guess what? I was on this program called Joe Rogan. Everyone tells me that they
Stephen,
saw it.
we've been following you from the beginning, so we didn't call it. Actually, I think I asked you to come on.
You were into ID before ID
the Joe Rogan.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, and this actually brings up another question. It famously the Dover case. What was that? 97, something like that.
It was 2005, but yeah,
we are so much further along than that, and I'm wondering, because we do see a groundswell in popular culture. I'm wondering if that were to say play out, do you think some of the variables that kind of fed into that case would be different today?
Well, quite possibly. The staunch Darwinists after the Dover case were dancing on our graves, saying it's over after Dover, perhaps not realizing that many of the most prominent people in the ID movement elected to stay out of that trial. Scott Minnick and Mike Behe did testify to defend their own work on the irreducible complexity of molecular machines, which had been maligned by some of the ACLU witnesses. But I chose not to testify. And part of the reason for that was we just thought the whole thing was very poorly framed. Mm-hmm. The local school board, which was, I suppose, well-meaning, had a fairly innocuous policy of having teachers read a statement telling students that there was a book in the library that discussed the theory of intelligent design. It ought to have been a yawner, but there were a couple things about it that the way they framed the policy that we didn't like. One is that it did mandate that the teachers read this statement, and we thought that was probably a bad idea. But more importantly, at the hearing where the policy was being discussed and advanced, one of the board members encouraged other board members to do this for the crucified one. And so this was an explicit statement of religious purpose, which by the Lemon test we knew was not going to pass muster in the court. And it was, of course, completely unnecessary and superfluous to what was being discussed, but that's what was on the record. And so we had urged the school board to withdraw the policy. And but there was a non-for-profit legal group that wanted to have the fight, and so the fight went on with the ACLU, and so it was just kind of a train wreck. But I chose to stay out of it, even though part of the discussion legally is the definition of science, which is an area of special interest to me as a philosopher of science. Fortunately, the case has only legal standing within this one central district in Pennsylvania. So on a national level, the legal standing of teaching about the theory of intelligent design, not indoctrinating students into it or any other idea, the teaching about it remains to be clarified. We have not been pushing that. We've been much more concerned to advance the case for intelligent design and to use intelligent design as a guide to research at the highest levels of scientific discourse and research. And so that's the interesting thing, though, is that many of the books that have really put the ID case on the map. I mean, there were some good ones before, but there's some good ones that have come, and that we've had a number of high-level scientific conversions to our point of view since Dover. I think Dover is just very far in the rearview mirror, and it's anything but the case that it's over after Dover. I think the ID research community is growing. We're attracting lots of young talent. We have young former students who are now tenured professors in their own right. And we've got books and articles, the number of peer-reviewed articles. About that time in 2005, the first peer-reviewed article, Advancing Intelligent Design, had just been published in 2004. That was the piece that I ended up I wrote that was published at the Smithsonian. We're at about 200 peer-reviewed articles now. And so this is, I think that's just an unstoppable force in the sense that nature is testifying in ways that are making lots of people see what we see. And at a certain point, you just can't suppress that. And I think that's what's happening.
So the movement is really growing from within at this point. It's not just, you're knocking on the door and trying to say, look here, but there's now it's grown.
We're not worried about public school battles, and we have advanced a policy that a number of state boards and local school districts have adopted, which is if you're going to teach Darwinian evolution, teach it well, which means teaching the arguments for it, but also the arguments and evidence that challenges the theory as you find those arguments and evidences in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. That's just a matter of scientific literacy. At the college level, there are plenty of professors who raise the ID issue. They've got academic freedom, or should, and honestly, we just have too many people breaking through into or senior professors who have come to our position, our perspective, who already have secure positions. And so it's getting harder and harder, I think, for the other side to suppress this. And some of the key public spokesmen for Darwinism are either, into retirement years or no longer active. And so I just think, the people that want to suppress discourse have moved on to other issues. And I think, younger scientists are still very aware. They hold our point of view. They've got to be careful within their department context and, that sort of thing. There's a lot of great stuff being published, good books, good peer-reviewed articles, good research projects. We've made key predictions about, for example, junk DNA that have been confirmed by independent studies. So I don't think it's over after Dover.
Okay.
Well, you make a good point though when you talk about the definition of science, because first of all, it's notoriously difficult to define what makes science. But if you take a Karl Popper approach, there needs to be a level of falsifiability. And what is the falsifiability of the evolutionary paradigm? What's the if you're going to do science, don't you have to have a counter to the evolutionary model?
Well, Popper famously developed the falsification criterion as a normative definition of science. He then noticed that both Freudian psychology and Darwinian evolution were a notoriously capable of slipping the noose and avoiding falsification, not because the predictions or empirical expectations that they had were being confirmed, but because there were easy auxiliary hypotheses that you could always attach to the theories to allow them to avoid falsification. I personally don't think that the Popperian characterization of how science works is accurate. I think lots of theories can easily add auxiliary hypotheses that will allow them to explain why the predictions that they've made or the expectations about data that they have are not what you observe. It might be that there was if you're in a controlled laboratory environment, it might be that your predicted the predicted consequence of your experiment didn't occur because there was something wrong with the experimental apparatus, or that the wind was blowing, or the sun was in your eyes, or that there was an interference of some kind. And many times that's been exactly the case. Newton, had a prediction based on his theory of gravity about planetary orbits that didn't come true. But scientists didn't abandon universal gravitation. They proposed that there might be another planet out there that was perturbing the orbits of the interior planets, and lo and behold, Neptune was later discovered. So falsification, as at least applied rigidly, is not really a hallmark of scientific status. And so that applies to Darwinian evolution, but it also applies to intelligent design. Lots and lots of people, and I can't, if I had a nickel for every time someone goes on the Facebook page and says, well, how is ID falsified? Well, I think that that's the wrong standard. If you apply it to ID and say, well, ID is not falsifiable by one single test experiment, you can do the same to Darwinism.
Mhm.
I think rather better model of how scientific theories are tested is what the Cambridge philosopher of science Peter Lipton called inference to the best explanation. That it's a matter of the preponderance of evidence, and it's a matter of comparing explanatory power or predictive success. Popper placed all his emphasis on predictive success, but good scientific theories are adjudicated in more than one way. They're adjudicated by their predictive success in some cases, but especially for historical scientific theories, they're adjudicated or evaluated or tested by reference to their explanatory power vis-a-vis their competitors. There's a comparative aspect to theory evaluation. And if you're talking about historical scientific theories, you're often talking about events that took place a long time ago. So you're not making predictions. Rather, you're trying to explain often data we already have. But that also takes place in physics. For example, there's a very astute historian of science who was at University of Maryland named Stephen Brush, who did a really careful study of the reception of the theory of general relativity, and found that it had been widely accepted by the physics community before the so-called crucial experiment involving light bending and eclipses and so forth in 1919 with Arthur Eddington. That was a prediction. The light bending, the ability to detect the bending of light, was a prediction of general relativity. But Brush points out that it had already been widely accepted because of its ability to explain what were already known facts of physics at the time, anomalies that had been unexplained on a classical approach. So explanatory power and predictive success, and an awareness of the preponderance of data and the success of one theory over and against another. There's a comparative aspect. Inference to the best explanation implies that there are competing hypotheses that may not be able to explain things as well as the hypothesis that's on the table. And anyway, point is, if you apply whatever standard of demarcation you apply in this debate, whether it's falsification or best explanation or repeatability, if you apply the standards, well, this is what I found in my research on the demarcation problem as it relates to the question of biological or cosmological origins. If you apply the standard rigidly in such a way as you would, for example, exclude intelligent design from being considered science. Oh, it's not falsifiable by a single predictive test. Turns out that if you apply that standard to Darwinism, it will also fail. Mm-hmm. If you apply a more realistic standard or characterization of how science works and say, well, is intelligent design a scientific theory? It turns out that if you apply a realistic standard that will validate one of the approaches to origins, it will inevitably validate the other. So the point of all that is that you can't use these abstract standards of scientific status or definitions that purport to define science normatively to settle the empirical question about what actually happened to cause life to arise on Earth. That's an empirical question. Anyway, long answer.
Well, that's good though. That clears up the problem with the criteria, right?
Yeah. There's a problem with the criteria. It's usually applied too rigidly, and if it disqualifies Newton, then I'm not sure what it really tells us about what science
disqualify basically everything then.
Okay. I just talked to an historian of science this week, a French historian of science, who said, that Pierre Duhem and but many historians of science will point to the moment when Newton unified the heavens and the earth by desacralizing the planets and getting rid of he got rid of the Aristotelian idea that the planets were being moved by spirits, by individual spirits, and that therefore the quintessential realm was different than the sublunar realm. And he said, no, he had both a scientific and a theological argument against that. Turns out that he thought it was it was the pagans were guilty of idolatry by making the individual planets essentially gods. And instead he unified the heavens and the earth by arguing that there was a single set of laws that applied to nature across time and space. And many historians say that is the moment when modern science began. Now,
right, we're basically say that.
But the point is, if Newton's approach is, in the view of many scientists, the thing that is the hallmark of modern science, then if you have a demarcation criterion that disqualifies Newton, you maybe better rethink your demarcation criteria.
There goes the whole project of modern science.
Yeah. Sorry about.
No, that's fine. There's several. Okay, I want to try and you've already said we've gotten so much information already. I want to already draw some things together. So we talked about the waning of what we might call, I always felt like the new atheists were kind of the last gasp of logical positivism, and we see then, there's an existential crisis in the culture, and all at the same time, people are now, deeply concerned about the collapse of, Western culture and the moral standards that Christianity had imbued into the culture. We have all of this emerging evidence from science itself to suggest, well, wait, there's a metaphysical basis here that, we don't have to reject anymore within the scientific community. So it's kind of an opening back up to what I always thought was, and I think I mentioned this to you when we met, you talked about Newton, the original project of science, right, was not it was more of natural, what was called natural philosophy, right? And metaphysics was part of scientia, and then metaphysics and science got separated in the early modern period. And then we wind up with, so one of the, let's get to,
yeah, supposedly separated, but what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is a subdiscipline of philosophy that's concerned about being, about what is reality. Does science make claims about reality? Well, sure. So then how do you create a strict demarcation between science and philosophy? You can't.
Right, you can't.
And this is the fallacy of the demarcationist program. But that is a consequence of logical positivism. The idea that there was a special method of reasoning that set science apart from all other modes of discourse, and therefore also conferred upon science a kind of special epistemic status, that scientific knowledge was somehow better than all other forms of knowledge.
Right.
And what
but
I've shown in
those philosophers had quite an impact. We talk about if it was Quine or Ayers.
Well, A.J. Ayer, but logical positivism blew apart within philosophy because it couldn't, for many, many reasons, it didn't provide an adequate characterization of how scientists actually work.
Right. Or of its own,
which is what Michael Polanyi showed in 1958 in his masterpiece, Personal Knowledge, but also its definition of what knowledge is. The idea that that unless something is logically undeniable and empirically verifiable, it can't be known. Well, could that statement be known? Was it logically undeniable or empirically verifiable? No, it had a problem of self-referential incoherence that didn't take long for philosophers to notice.
Self-defeating.
And so I remember being at a conference in 1986 with A.J. Ayer, who was, famous for having been one of the founders of logical positivism, and obviously it went back into the 19th century as well. But in the 20th century, he was the guy. But he was kind of in this conference. I was young right out of school, but it was pretty obvious that he wasn't being taken seriously by anyone. He was kind of a sort of court jester figure at this conference. Otherwise, also very prominent academics. It's just that the idea he represented was already understood to not work within philosophy. But yet, the advocates of the new atheism are basically trafficking in that sort of train of thought.
And everybody, who watched those, send that Dawkins and others were quite philosophically inept. They just were not up to speed on on where philosophy was, thinking that, they're just assuming this kind of naive positivism, right? And that really came out then when they would go up against, I think, you or William Lane Craig or others. So, okay, let's get to the book now, the new book. And and we'll put in, I mean, this is the third book that you've authored yourself. You have other books that you've co-authored, like this beast here, with our friend and colleague at Talbot J.P. Moreland. But the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, right here. And I'm going to do my best Peter Robinson impression now. And because I want to read.
He's a terrific interviewer, isn't he?
Yeah, he's great. I mean, I'm not. Yeah, so this will just be
really,
an impression.
Really great American. I don't know if you know that. He, as a 27-year-old speechwriter, wrote.
Oh yeah, no, I heard that. Yeah,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
He wrote that Reagan speech. Yeah, because I went to the Reagan Library recently, and that story's laid out there.
I've heard a talk that he's given telling the backstory of that. It's absolutely fascinating. So.
I think I watched that same talk. Right. Yeah. Well, and that's right. You had that interview with him, Murray, and Holland, who we also follow those gentlemen as well, and they've made quite a positive impact, I'd say, culturally. But let me read I want to read two of the endorsements, just because I want people to understand, I mean, here's one by Brian Josephson, Nobel laureate in physics, talking about defining science. This book, quote from the back of the book, this book makes clear that far from being unscientific, intelligent design is valid science, end quote. Okay, so that's from a Nobel laureate in physics. And then I love this endorsement you got from, I don't know if I'll be able to say his name correctly, Eskelman.
Oh, Michael Eshelman.
Eshelman from Boston University. And you got to be pleased with this endorsement. It says, with this book, Stephen Meyer earns a place in the pantheon of distinguished, non-reductive natural philosophers of the last 120 years, from the great French savant Pierre Duhem through A.N. Whitehead to Michel or Michael Polanyi. And it goes on, end quote there. So tell us about the book. It seems to be sort of a magnus opus for you. You're bringing a lot of threads together from your previous book, Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and you're making several conclusions that lead to a theistically designed universe.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this since the mid-'80s when I was working at the time as an industry geophysicist and attended a conference on the big questions in science: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin and nature of human consciousness. And I first, because I met a scientist, Charles Thaxton, who had written a very important book about the origin of life and who functioned very generously as a mentor for me. Of those big questions, the one I took on first was the question of the origin of life. I did my PhD on the subject of origin of life biology, and it took me a while, but I eventually produced a book, Signature in the Cell, about the origin of life question, and made the argument that the evidence we have of design in the cell, in particular the digital code present in the DNA molecule, is best explained by the activity of a designing intelligence of some kind. I extended that argument in Darwin's Doubt by arguing that the many features of animals, in particular the information that's stored in the cells that help them to be built, as well as the information processing system and the circuitry that's involved in animal development and many other, and even patterns in the fossil record, also suggested the activity of a designing agent of some kind. In neither of the two books did I attempt to make an argument that the intelligence responsible was a transcendent intelligence, namely the deity. I did indicate, I think, in both books that I myself had theistic leanings and was in fact a Christian, but I didn't make an argument about that. Many of my readers, after reading the first two books, naturally wanted to know, well, who do you think the designing intelligence responsible for life is? And what can science tell us about that question? And that's what I took on in the third book. It wasn't a new question to me. I'd been thinking about it, as I said, since the mid-1980s. But what I did in the new book was expand the data set to include cosmology and physics. And the reason for that is that there were and are scientists who have proposed that, well, yes, we are seeing evidence of design in life, but isn't it possible that the designing intelligence responsible for life is an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, a kind of maybe a super intelligence on another planet, a space alien? This is the hypothesis of panspermia, and that seems rather exotic, but no less a personage than Francis Crick proposed it in a book called Life Itself in 1980 or 81. And even Richard Dawkins floated the idea in his interview with Ben Stein in the film Expelled. I think he later regretted that, but nevertheless, it occurred to him. And there have been other figures, Chandra Wickramasinghe and Fred Hoyle, that have considered this as well. And so if you think, if you become convinced, as I am, and I hope I made a convincing case in the first two books, that there is in fact evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence in the history of life, then the question that's raised naturally is, well, is that an immanent intelligence within the cosmos or a transcendent intelligence? Is it an alien or God? Mm-hmm. And so I naturally wanted to look at the evidence that we have about design from the very beginning of the universe, and that's what we call the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, and the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe. And I think there's a very compelling case there to be made for intelligent design as well. But what's clear there is that the evidence of design that we have from the very beginning of the universe, when the fine-tuning parameters were set, is not a class of evidence that could be explained by any immanent intelligence within the cosmos, because any space alien that evolved on some future planet well after the beginning of the universe would have evolved after the beginning of the universe, and therefore could not have been the cause of the fine-tuning present from the beginning of the universe, nor could such a being have been responsible for the origin of the universe itself. And so I looked at both the evidence that we have for a cosmological beginning or a singularity at the beginning, and evidence of the fine-tuning from the beginning, and suggested that that class of evidence could only be explained by a transcendent and therefore theistic or deistic type of designing agent. And so then, as I got further into the argument of the book, I weighed the explanatory power not of specific scientific hypotheses, but of these competing metaphysical systems of theism, deism, pantheism, materialism, and even variants on those worldviews such as panentheism and so forth. So, and there I argue that surprisingly perhaps, but theism as a philosophical system provides the best overall explanation of the evidence that we have about biological, physical, and cosmological origins. And that I call the return of the God hypothesis.
Yeah. So, I want to get to specifically after you eliminate the materialistic and even the pantheistic, which I thought was very important actually to do an analysis of how a pantheistic worldview matches up with the evidence, because I see some returns. I see some movements going on that are embracing a sort of a type of pantheism. And I'll talk about that maybe in a second, but I'm glad you did point that out as well as a possible hypothesis, but then where you say also show how pantheism fails. And then we'll get into some of the distinctions between the deistic or the evolutionary theistic versus the evolutionary theistic evolution views versus the view that you're defending. But just to take one step back, I want to talk about, because you mentioned Thaxton, who was a mentor to you, And I think in the book you say he and some of his colleagues, maybe Bradley and Olson as well, they were the ones to start talking about intelligent causation.
Right.
And now I'm wondering that with regards to this, and we talked about this artificial division between science and metaphysics, but there seems one of the main bones of contention from the naturalists is that we have to hold to some kind of methodological naturalism, right, in order to do science. So I can imagine an objection like, if we start to talk in terms of agency involved in natural processes somehow, well, how can we scientifically talk about an agent that would have something like a free will? Because we can't really scientifically analyze a free being of that sort, or a causal agent that has, freedom of the will. So how would we respond to something like that?
Well, I think there's an asymmetry often in science between explanation and prediction. We can often explain something that we couldn't have predicted. This has been well noted by the great philosopher of science, Michael Scriven, in a series of articles in the late 1950s and early 60s. And it's a well-accepted thesis, I think, within the philosophy of science. There's lots of examples of it. Darwinism, for example, can explain things that it can't predict. If you regard the mutation selection mechanism as the driving force of evolutionary innovation, and you want to say, and you think that mechanism provides a sufficient explanation for the origin of new forms of life, you nevertheless can't predict what it's going to do next. The whole point of mutations being random precludes the idea that you can make predictions. So Scriven was defending the scientific status of Darwinism by saying, you can often explain what you can't predict, and it's a perfectly legitimate thing for a hypothesis to explain something, even if it can't make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. And agency has the same sort of characteristic. We can predict. We can't predict what a free agent is going to do, but we can predict, but not with certainty, because the whole notion of freedom precludes the idea that things are completely law governed and deterministically bound. But we can explain events by reference to agency, because we can detect clear signatures of the activity of agency, and we do it all the time. If you walk outside and you look at a stop sign, you know that was put there by a personal agent because of just the very low level of information content that's in the sign. If you see a hieroglyphic inscription and you're an archaeologist, you know that wasn't put there by wind and erosion. So we can explain by reference to intelligent causes, even if we can't predict what intelligent agents will do.
Good. So we're on the same.
And there again,
whether it's randomness or
you're on the exact
agency.
same epistemological footing as the competing hypothesis of Darwinism,
right,
or chemical evolution. You're talking about
for forensic science trades in this all the time. I mean, that's the whole point. Right. You have free agents. It was this. Did this person pass on because of natural causes, or was there a free agent involved in the murder?
Exactly. And we don't say, well, you can only consider natural causes if you're a forensic investigator. You need to be open to anything that might have actually been in play. And this is the problem with methodological naturalism when it comes to addressing these questions of origins and some other questions in science, is that it's really begging the question. The thing we want to know is not what was the most likely naturalistic explanation or cause of the event we're looking at. We want to know what actually happened to cause the event, and if it's logically possible that an agent was involved, then we need to be open to the evidence of such agency if it's there. And again, the analogy to something like the Rosetta Stone is very apt. Imagine you have a bunch of archaeologists looking at those inscriptions, and one of them tumbles to the realization that, oh, that's 3 different languages. Those are 3 different informational scripts. There must have been an intelligent scribe involved. And the other archaeologists say, no, we can't consider that. It's got to be something purely naturalistic. Well, you're just shutting down the inquiry. It's prematurely, that so you have a presuppositionally driven conclusion that may be at odds with what the actual evidence is telling you, and that same possibility exists when you're looking at the evidence concerning the origin of life. If we've got digital code in DNA and it looks for all the world like what we know only programmers produce, then maybe there was a master programmer for life. We can't preclude that consideration a priori from the outset of the investigation. We've got to look at what the evidence shows.
Right. It's an unnecessary and often unfortunate constraint.
Right. Absolutely.
On the investigation into reality itself, the reality of nature. Excellent.
Yeah,
so
it's at least logically possible that the personal agent and intelligence existed prior to the advent of life on planet Earth.
Right.
You know, maybe you have strong reasons for thinking that unlikely, but it's a logical possibility, and therefore it's an explanation that we need to be open to considering and refuting, perhaps, but certainly considering.
When you talk throughout the book about the sort of causal options that are on the table for the things that we see, if you constrain yourself to a metaphysical or methodological naturalism, you have roughly two options: chance and necessity, right? Or you say some kind of combination of the two.
Yeah, Darwinism typically combines the two with a random or stochastic variations plus a law-like process of natural selection. Whether it actually can be cashed out as a formal law mathematically in the way physics people do or not is debatable, but it's law-like in that it's a kind of a regularity.
Right. Well, then those also seem to war against the principle of sufficient reason, especially that of chance at some point, where you just say, well, the laws of nature are the fundament, period, end of story. And then you talk also throughout the book how laws don't generate information. Right. I mean, it's not the laws that create the information that is needed for the natural processes to get going.
Laws either describe what we write down as a law describes regularities in nature that we observe. But if some process is highly regular, then from an information theoretic standpoint, it generates what's called redundancy. The same thing over and over and over and over and over again. Sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset. All unsupported bodies fall. Drop the wallet. I could do it a million times. You get the same input, same outcome. Well, that's not an informative process. Once you've seen it once, you know it's going to happen again and again and again. But what we mean by information, it requires a freedom from law-like determinism, where there are contingencies at each step that could go one way or another. And so every time, an informational sequence, well, like the information we're generating right now, is not reducible to a simple law or algorithm. It's aperiodic, it's complex, not regular, and it's does not have the qualitative characteristics of processes that are law-like. So there's this kind of non-starter in origin of life research where people have said, well, maybe we'll discover a law that will explain the origin of the information in DNA. Well, if you discover a law, which the law is going to describe a highly regular process, but the information in DNA is by definition not redundant and repetitive. If it was, you'd have a mantra, right. AG, 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 rather than highly variable sequences of characters that are expressing information in accord with an independent symbol convention, right. Which is very different than a law-like process.
Well, and I think it's important to point out then at the existential, this is also kind of the difference between the impersonal and personal, right? I mean, a law is just an impersonal kind of description, but if you're getting a sequenced and complex message that's delivering meaning, then this starts to look like not just a law-like process, but a mind, right? Again, back to agency.
It's one of the ways, maybe the key way, that we detect the activity of a mind.
Right, exactly. Which I think that's where people start to get nervous.
And when you say detect, you're talking about explaining the presence of something in a sense. So if we go back to that explain versus prediction dichotomy. We can't predict what minds will do, but because we know the kind of things that minds typically do, when we see those things, in particular, information-rich sequences of characters, then we can infer that a mind was at work. We can retrodict what we couldn't have predicted.
Right. Well, I appreciated your references to Claude Shannon and information theory. I grew up in a household of engineers. My father was in information theory for 40 years at Notre Dame. And I only started understanding what he was doing after reading the parts in your book. So that he knew Claude Shannon personally and would talk about him, but I never understood it until I read the book.
One of those certified geniuses
Yeah,
of the
next level. Right, exactly.
Neumann and Shannon and Weaver and Crick and so yeah.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.